Anyway, so that is the anticlimactic story of the Weather Underground. We have to judge them by their works, and in so doing, there is nothing to be said but that they were a colossal failure. At no point did they ever create the sort of generalized protest movement, resistance movement that they dreamed they could. Never happened. Their violence ended up redounding to no one's benefit. There's a lot of people who say that they totally undermined and fucked up the left. Other people say that they provided a inspiration for some more militant urban elements. I don't honestly know. My guess is it was probably counterproductive. But, I mean, the fact is they were reacting to the reality, which was that the trajectory of the left by the late 60s was very much in doubt. There was no more momentum going forward after all of the huge breakthroughs in the middle of the decade. It was petering out. Reaction was coming back full force. So in that respect, you understand their desire to do that. But they didn't succeed. And we can evaluate their motives in two ways. One is the way that I've already said, that the frustration and real bone-deep horror at what America was perpetrating at home and abroad was too much, and that they were morally right to do what they were doing. But there was another part of it, too, which is that they were essentially self-centered in that what they really cared about was absolving themselves of responsibility for what their country was doing. And they've said this, like if you look at the Weather Underground documentary that was done a few years ago, interviews with them, is that they say this outright, which is that they say, not doing anything would have made me complicit. Not doing anything would have made me as much of a criminal, as much of a perpetrator of violence as anyone in the Pentagon. I have a moral responsibility to stop this. But what that really means is that you're saying that what matters more than anything is that my personal conscience is clear, that my actions absolve me. Not that I actually affect change. That is second to the main point of absolving oneself from personal responsibility. And that certainly speaks to that generation's emerging self-fixation, the idea that there's some sort of special meaning imbued in the one's self-perception, and that maintaining a high self-perception is key to advancing in the world successfully or meaningfully or satisfyingly. And that is less commendable, more greedy. But I'd say that the main failing of them, the main failure of the Weather Underground and the SDS before them, was that they were not connected in any way to a broader class movement. They were middle-class college kids at the end of the day. And that cut them off in a critical way from any kind of broader effect. Their violence was always going to be idiosyncratic and personal. It was always going to be evaluated by other people and by their hoped-for proletarian audience as a personalized act, something that didn't connect to them in any meaningful way, because they didn't make those connections. They attempted to. There were these efforts called jailbreaks, where they tried to recruit members by going to high schools and basically telling the kids, this is a conformity factory. You're being turned into a willing servant of empire. You're turning into a slave. You need to break out of this jail. Come with us. Very alienating, had very little effect, got very few members that way. There were other efforts too, but nothing ever coalesced into conduits to these communities they were trying to reach. Black communities in the inner cities and poor whites and workers everywhere. They never made that connection. And so their violence, their actions, no matter what they were, had no resonance beyond their individual lives. And while you might blame them for not recognizing that, for suffering from that enthusiastic, youthful student myopia that tells you that what's right in front of you is the most important thing in the world and the only thing that matters, and I'm going to move towards this goal with all of the passion and blood in my body, which is understandable, but it means you miss the bigger picture. So I don't know if we can blame them for that, but we certainly have to acknowledge that it was a failure to not recognize it. And what they were failing to recognize is the fundamental challenge of the left in the post-war era. All right, so I actually made this point in an episode of Chapo from very nearly beginning of the show. Some of you might not have heard of it, others you might have forgotten about it. But either way, I really feel like I want to expand on this idea a little more. And it's that if we're going to look at America through a lens of class, which we have to do if we want to evaluate its reception, its receptiveness to change, because class is the motor of history. I mean, I'm sorry, you can disagree, but that's fine. That's what Marx said. It's been, I think, confirmed. I think it's unarguable is that is the magma. That's the magma that moves the tectonic plates is class. If you think that, and you think that evaluating a social structure for its amenability to change depends on analyzing its class structure, then the most fruitful comparison of the post-war American quote-unquote working class is to, if we look back to the Marxist categories that Marx created in his life, which were all of times well before the advanced capitalism and industrialism and post-industrialism of the United States came into being. The categories he was familiar with, the one that American people post-war most resemble, is none of the ones in his understanding when he breaks down what a working class is. None of the urban working classes that he talks about as the people who are going to overthrow capitalism. None of them. It is a reactionary class that he talks about in his book, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, the French peasantry, the French small-holding peasantry. I feel like of the categories that Marx was able to observe and sketch, post-war Americans most resemble the French peasantry of the 1840s. And that is for the reason of the way that class comes into consciousness. So this is the quote that is often referenced by people who want to make some argument that Marx hated farmers or some shit, when the context of it is that he's not criticizing farmers by calling them this. He's merely using a comparison to show the way that class operates in their lives. But anyway, this is a famous quote from the 18th Brumaire, describing the peasants who had voted in the presidential election to elect Louis Napoleon, Napoleon's dipshit fail nephew, as president. And Marx, breaking down all the classes who were on the different sides of the French political scene after the February Revolution of 1848, the question is left, well, why did all these peasants, these workers really, these people who depended on the market and who had foes with it and who were exploited, how did they ratify this bourgeois reactionary? And this is his way of explaining it. The small-holding peasants form an immense mass whose members live in similar conditions but without entering into manifold relations with each other. Their mode of production isolates them from one another instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse. The isolation is furthered by France's poor means of communication and the poverty of the peasants. Their field of production, the small holding, permits no division of labor in its cultivation, no application of science, and therefore no multifariousness of development, no diversity of talent, no wealth of social relationships. Each individual peasant family is almost self-sufficient, directly produces most of its consumer needs, and thus acquires its means of life more through an exchange with nature than an intercourse with society. A small holding, the peasant and his family, beside it another small holding, another peasant, and another family. A few score of these constitute a village, and a few score villages constitute a department. Thus, the great mass of the French nation is formed by the simple addition of anonymous magnitudes, much as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. So what Marx is saying there should be pretty clear. He's saying that the way that class consciousness emerges is not by people reading. It's not by people spontaneously coming to the understanding that socialism is the future. It's by experience. They labor. They are exploited. They suffer. They are discontent by this. They are alienated from themselves and their labor by this. And this experience creates consciousness because it is shared by thousands of other people in your immediate vicinity, hundreds to thousands. People who are suffering the same indignities, the same alienation, and thus are able to confirm with one another the same diagnosis and come together to say, we want to change this. We understand that our enemies are the people making us do this. Our enemies are the people forcing us to do this. Our enemies are the one extracting profit from our labor while doing nothing themselves. And they work together, but they also live together. They're in these tightly packed working class suburbs in Paris and in inner cities and other European capitals. So they wake up together, they go work together, they come back to the neighborhoods, they drink together, they compare experiences, and that experience makes them all realize at some point, what the fuck? What are these motherfuckers doing to us? It's the point where Marx says in another writing that a class goes from being a class in itself to a class for itself. A class that just isn't a constituted group, but a constituted group that is self-aware, that understands its predicament and has rightly identified its enemies, its fucking boss. The one guy who pulls the fucking whistle at the beginning of the day, marches everybody into the factory, marches them out at the end of the night, and collects all the money from all the labor. That's the enemy. That's what working in those conditions does. Peasants didn't have that experience. Peasants work on their land. For the most part, they only work with their immediate family. 19th century concepts would never have imagined that like making your kid or your wife do work on your farm constitutes exploitation. It's part of the family unit or whatever. So class relations don't exist. Class conflict doesn't exist. Their neighbors are not in view. They don't see them every day. They don't interact with them. They don't bond over shared experiences the same way. They live isolated lives. It's something that Marx called the rural idiocy of life in a farm. And they don't have a antagonist. Their antagonist and also their sort of lover is nature. The nature can destroy them. Nature can raise them up. And that's really the fight to sort of get nature on their side that dominates their intellectual concept of antagonism. It's nature. They take the goods to market, but the price is set elsewhere. It's mystified. Their experience with the soil and the sun and the rain, that's real. And that is their world. And that means that they're not going to grow class consciousness. They don't have horizontal social relationships. They only have family relationships. Their understanding of the world around them is not created by interaction with people within their vicinity. It's hierarchical, vertical relationships with the church and the state in the form of almost legendary folk wisdom and stuff, and nothing that came from neighbors specifically. Like, you're not thinking of people, you're thinking of a concept of a state, and more importantly of a church, certainly during the feudal period, less so during the modern one, but still strong in the countryside, in the sense that your relationship is with God, your relationship with his estate in the form of the king or the archbishop or someone who stands in for God. It's all up. It's all looking up. None of it's looking to the side. It's all looking up. Those are your social relationships. And so when it was time to vote for a president after the 48 revolution drove off the July monarchy, the answers to these political questions can't be found from experience, can't be found from intercourse, as Marx would call it, with fellow members of your class. It could only come from folk memory. The last moment for these people in the mid 1800s, these older people, the last time that they could remember France being in its apogee of being great was during Napoleon's reign. And even those who were too young to experience it certainly heard the tales of French glory. So when someone is on the ballot with that name, that magical name, Napoleon, how else are you going to make your decision? Why wouldn't you choose to make France great again with this mystical name, this name that connects to something? It's the only name on this ballot that connects to something. Everything else is abstract. They're just words on a page that have no experience, that have no connection to your life. This has a connection to the life of you, or if you remember Napoleon, or your father if you remember Napoleon, of your neighbors when you speak of Napoleon, when you do speak, and your family, and then you have a picture of him or something. That means something. And so they voted for Napoleon, the name that meant something to them, because they didn't have another way of understanding politics. Now, obviously, post-war American subject is not in any way the same situation. Our connection to the land was severed generations ago. our contact with agriculture is totally through the barriers of currency and processing and capitalism. There is no connection to anything you could even remotely call natural for most of us. It is a simulated, abstracted world. But we are isolated and moved away from horizontal interaction in the same way that those French peasants were. After World War II, after the largesse generated by being the hyperpower with the only manufacturing capability that was intact after World War II, when that magnificence would spread across this burgeoning white middle class, Americans were basically dispersed to the winds in suburbs. So suburbanization cast people from these tightly knit workers' neighborhoods, these urban workers' neighborhoods, because that is such a key to class consciousness as Marx understood it. And the thing is that this was something that he basically anticipated, because a lot of the class categories that Marx talked about in 1848 had not yet really come into view in Europe. In a lot of the Industrial Revolution was highly advanced in some parts of Europe, like the UK, but not in others, and it was not evenly sparsed out. So he was anticipating this. But by the end of that century, the end of the 19th century, after he had died, you really saw that the reality of having mass industrial production was that people came together into these communities. The suburbs in Paris that are now these seething immigrant belts were called, at this period, the Red Belt. It was just this belt of neighborhoods that all voted communist and were not to be persuaded on the political question, who understood things. And that was just par for the course in Europe, these tightly compacted red neighborhoods. But those were broken up by housing policy after World War II. People were scattered to the winds of these suburbs with the quarter-acre lot and the separation from one another. And you were either broken up geographically or you were isolated geographically by racism, by this maniacal need to quarantine black people, most of whom were workers, from everyone else. So barriers were thrown up racially and geographically across the country. So that was the beginning of it. After World War II was this spreading out, this geographic separation that separated everybody from each other. And then the other thing that came in that Marx obviously could never have anticipated was mass media, because just as these tendrils of suburbia are being thrown out from every major city, just as walls are going up to ensure that black and minority workers are ghettoized, also all those homes are being filled with televisions and the culture the television creates, which obliterates the old animal spiritual need to just be out and amongst other people, to be out amongst people who you are not seeing every day, people who give your life variety and change. Well, you don't need that anymore. There's a fucking box in your living room that will give that to you and will present you with a unified ideological framework. Like all art will comport to this narrow spectrum of capitalist ideology. And so those two forces, media and geography, start the process by which people, this unified working class or white working class, because that was part of the grim deal of American racial hierarchy, started to break up. And then it was exacerbated in the coming years by the fact that even the working conditions that Marx talked about, where hundreds of people were in a factory together, those were broken up. Factories were cast off into smaller areas so that they were less important to the supply chain, but in reality, less vulnerable to a mass shutdown. So first they were scattered into the winds, these factories, into areas with less robust labor laws, for example, in the South. And then when liberalization happened in the 70s, across into lower union density and lower standard of living countries. And so those workplaces, the old shop floors, the fucking shop floors where the Petersburg Soviet was born, they were gone. And in their place was a patchwork of retail and service industry and smaller workplaces with fewer employees interacting with each other at a given time. More turnover, so less time to make connections with people. So those forces over the years have created a situation where those horizontal social relationships, which build class consciousness in the old working class urban neighborhoods, was broken up and replaced with the old French peasant vertical relationship. Because you're once again with your family, broken away, inwardly focused. I'm sure that some of those French peasants, their small hold wasn't much bigger than the acreage of a nice suburban home in Long Island or something, in Levittown. So you're back to that. You're back to that geographic separation from your fellow. I mean, you don't work there, but you work somewhere else where you only interact with people, and then you're back and you're never seeing them again. You're not walking back to the same neighborhood the way you were with the people you worked with in the factories in the years before. So now you're broken up in that same way. And once again, your only way to even imagine that you're living in a community or in a country with a shared value system and history and vocabulary is through media, television, movies, the internet. This is how you know that you're in America. This is how you know that America is anything. This is how you have a vocabulary to talk about America, is by that vertical relationship to mediated concepts and media figures. It can't be stressed enough the degree to which politics and culture in America are personalized, because we don't have concepts to talk about things because we don't have shared experiences that can lead us to conclusions. We only have things brought from above, sort of dropped on our heads. And they come in these forms born by these recurring visages, these brands, and these people. And so we relate to them as these givers, essentially a cultural cargo cult. And so these are the people who tell us things. And so we relate to politics on a purely personal level. I mean, much has been made about how there's no ideological consistency between the people who hated Obama and loved Trump, the people who hated this gay Muslim but loved this fancy, flighty, Queenie, New York real estate kibitzer, and decide that he's an alpha male. I mean, how does that happen? It happens because none of these categories mean anything other than our ability to impress upon symbols that are embodied by people. Like that's why that's why the left reform movement in America is honestly in trouble once fucking Bernie Sanders dies, because yes, when Bernie showed up in the 16 election, he was showing up at a time when people were ready to hear a socialist message, but they needed someone to put those feelings into, and Bernie was the vessel. He was this old slovenly guy, direct, blunt, to the point. It wasn't just that he was saying the things that people could relate to, it's that he presented himself in a way that felt authentic. And even if there were 15 senators and 100 congresspeople who had Bernie's exact record and beliefs, if they didn't have his presentation of authenticity, they would be less appealing to voters and to Americans. And so anybody that comes after Bernie, unless he's a fucking clone, is going to have he's going to have less authenticity, and so he's going to be less appealing to voters because people can only relate at that symbolic level. They have no other language to talk about politics or understand it. And of course, this is why in 2016, enough Americans were able to look at the grasping, bloated, horrific, monstrous visage of Donald Trump and be like, you know what? Fuck it, go for it. Because that's what only understanding the world through these celebrity avatars will lead you to. A guy shows up, you see him your entire life on television as this figure of massive success and awesomeness and total fucking ownage. This guy who cuts his way through life without giving a shit, gets whatever he wants, bosses everybody around. How would you not see him and say, yes, this is the man to lead us out of these doldrums? Because what else do you have? It's the way that the French peasants looked at Louis Napoleon and thought of the fucking empire. You look at Trump, or these people looked at Trump, and they saw a life that was like what they saw on TV. So that is why I say that while the French peasants of the mid 1800s that Marx talked about were potatoes in a sack, these natural things pulled from the earth and still covered with loam thrown into a bag, we are similar but different in the sense that we are the potatoes pulled from the earth, but then peeled, diced, processed, adulterated, reconfigured, fried, stacked mechanically, placed into the same isolation from each other, but in a rigidly mechanical form, the way that we come into the world fundamentally incapable of relating to nature the way that these French peasants did, changed deeply by our relationship to technology and media. So we are not potatoes in a sack. We are instead Pringles in a tube. And the SDS was always fighting against this current, always trying to reknit these connections that have been severed. They were never able to do it. And part of that is because they were a bunch of dipshit middle-class college kids. But the other part of it is because those severing of ties is the most salient issue that exists on the American left. It is the signal challenge of those who seek to build some sort of consensus around change, around overcoming the savage limitations of capitalism, saving the earth and saving humanity. This question of breaking up those chips into something different is the one that should be all in the front of all of our minds whenever we think of how the hell we're going to get out of this. All right. Well, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed yourself. I had a good time. I'll talk to you dudes on the flippity flop.